The crowd inside London's Ronnie Scott's Club had no idea what was about to happen. The smoke-stained room buzzed with the usual Friday night chatter when a quiet man in black slid onto a bar stool. Guitarists in the know felt the hair on their arms rise. Jeff Beck was in the building. Beck's eyes scanned the stage like a hawk. He wasn't here for fame or for another late-night jam. He was hunting ghosts, the three guitarists whose playing had once knocked the breath out of him and rewired his entire understanding of music. In interviews, he called them the Three Kings, a title spoken with the weight of royalty and danger. B.B. King, Albert King, and Freddie King. Most fans only ever hear these names in passing. But for Jeff Beck, each of these men was a seismic event, a living earthquake who turned an electric guitar into a weapon of emotion. Before Hendrix burned a Stratocaster,
some girlfriend rang up and said, "You got to hear this guy, Jimi Hendrix." And I went, "Oh, really?" She said, "Yeah, I was at a club last night."
Before Page filled arenas with thunder, these kings had already drawn blood from 6 strings. Tonight, we go inside the stories Beck himself whispered with reverence. You'll hear of life and death tours, guitar solos that made seasoned players cry, and confrontations that tested even Beck's fearless spirit. This is not a polite history lesson. This is the sound of blues as survival, of men who played like every note might be their last, and of one British guitarist who stood in their shadow and dared to follow. B.B. King. The Velvet Blade. B.B. King never shouted. He didn't need to. With a single note from his beloved black Gibson, named Lucille, he could slice through a stadium like a scalpel through silk. To Jeff Beck, that restraint was terrifying. He could make one note speak louder than my whole guitar arsenal, Beck once said, shaking his head as if still stunned. BB's journey began in the Mississippi Delta, where poverty and segregation pressed on every side. He worked cotton fields, sold himself to radio gigs, and carried a guitar like a lifeline. By the time he hit Beale Street in Memphis, the blues was more than music. It was a survival code. Beck devoured those early recordings, marveling at how B.B. bent strings upward instead of sliding down, creating a sound that cried without ever breaking. The magic of B.B. King wasn't speed or flash, it was control. Guitarists talk about tone the way chefs talk about flavor, and B.B. owned a recipe no one could copy. He kept his right hand feather light, barely picking, letting the amplifier bloom the note until it hovered in the air. Then he'd add a shimmer of vibrato so smooth it seemed to suspend time. Beck once confessed he tried for years to imitate it and failed every time. "It's like chasing a ghost," he said. Their first real meeting was in the late 1960s, after Beck's star had risen with the Yardbirds. B.B. was already a legend. According to those present, Beck approached the backstage door like a nervous student, guitar case in hand. When the King finally invited him in, the room fell silent. B.B. smiled that slow, knowing smile and said, "Show me what you got, son." Beck launched into a ferocious run of pentatonics, fast, fiery, unmistakably British blues. B.B. listened, nodded, then lifted Lucille and played a single bending wail that seemed to open the floor beneath them. Beck lowered his guitar without a word. Lesson learned. But B.B. King was more than a technician, he was a storyteller. Songs like "The Thrill Is Gone" and "Every Day I Have the Blues" weren't just performances. They were confessions set to 12 bars. Beck admired how B.B. could stand before thousands and turn heartache into a communal ritual. "It's not licks," Beck said. "It's life coming through that guitar." The respect was mutual. In later years, B.B. often invited Beck on stage during UK tours. Audiences witnessed 2 generations of blues colliding, Beck weaving exploratory runs around B.B.'s soulful economy. Critics wrote of a conversation between master and disciple, though Beck always rejected the disciple label. "He's the king," Beck said simply. "I just try not to get in the way." B.B.'s influence seeped into Beck's own records in surprising ways. Listen to "Cause We've Ended as Lovers" or "Where Were You?" and you'll hear the same vocal phrasing, the same willingness to let silence speak. Beck's famed use of the tremolo bar to create vocal-like inflections, a direct homage to the microbends BB, used with nothing more than fingers and soul. Perhaps the most dramatic testament to BB's impact came during a 2003 tribute concert. Beck took the stage to honor the aging King, who was then battling diabetes and fatigue. Mid-song, Beck leaned into a single sustained note, eyes closed, and the crowd erupted. BB responded with his own one-note cry, a duel of pure feeling that brought the audience to tears. No pyrotechnics, no shredding, just two men bending time with sound. What made BB King so dangerous in Beck's eyes was that he proved less could be more deadly than more. Guitarists who relied on speed and volume found themselves powerless against that velvet blade of tone. "You can't fake soul," Beck often said. "BB taught me that." To the end of his life, Beck carried that lesson like a talisman. Whenever interviewers pressed him for the secret to great guitar playing, he rarely mentioned technique. Instead, he'd lower his voice and say, "Feel." That's BB's gift. If you can't make a note feel like it matters, put the guitar down. Albert King, the left-handed storm. When Jeff Beck first heard Albert King's guitar tone, he swore someone had wired the amplifier straight into a thundercloud. It wasn't just loud, it was elemental. Albert's sound rolled like a Midwestern storm across the Mississippi River, rattling windows and setting nerves on edge. It was dangerous, Beck later recalled. You didn't know if the ceiling would stay on the building when he hit those notes. Albert King's journey was as unlikely as his technique. Born Albert Nelson in rural Indianola, Mississippi, he grew up surrounded by cotton fields and church hymns. But unlike many bluesmen, Albert didn't start on a guitar built for right-handed players and simply flip it around. He strung his instrument completely upside down, bass strings on the bottom, treble on top, and played left-handed. The result was a physics-defying style that gave every bend an extra half-turn of agony. Notes didn't just cry, they howled. Jeff Beck, already a prodigy by the time he encountered Albert's records, admitted that King's phrasing felt alien. Most guitarists bend a string upward to raise pitch. Albert bent downward and sometimes even pulled notes behind the nut for microtones no textbook could explain. It made the guitar talk in a language nobody else spoke, Beck said. I spent months trying to decode it. The meeting of these two forces happened in the late 1960s, when British blues was exploding. Beck was headlining clubs across London, but he still carried a fan's reverence when Albert King rolled into town. Albert arrived with his trademark Flying V, nicknamed Lucy, and a band that played with the menace of a freight train. Legend has it that before the show, Beck snuck into the sound check and watched wide-eyed as Albert dialed his amp past the point of polite society. He didn't care about clean tone, Beck later laughed. It was dirt and fire, the real stuff. That night, Beck witnessed a set that felt like a sermon and a street fight all at once. Albert's opening number, Born Under a Bad Sign, rattled the floorboards. He stalked the stage, 6'4" and broad as a door, squeezing notes until the crowd gasped. Every solo sounded like a confession pulled from the depths of the Delta. Beck stood frozen near the side curtain, realizing he was in the presence of something primal. What fascinated Beck most wasn't sheer power, it was Albert's restraint. Between bursts of fury, King left canyons of silence. He might lean on a single note for a full measure, letting the audience squirm. He taught me that space is as heavy as sound, Beck explained. Sometimes the threat of the next note is bigger than the note itself. Their eventual backstage encounter became part of blues folklore. Beck approached cautiously, almost like a pilgrim. Albert, famously intimidating, looked him up and down. After a long pause, he said, "You play that rock stuff, huh?" Show Me Beck lifted his Strat and slid into a blistering run of British blues licks. Albert listened, then answered with a single downward bend so deep it felt like the floor might collapse. Beck lowered his guitar. "That was the whole dictionary in one note," he later said. Beyond technique, Beck admired Albert's fearless independence. While many bluesmen chased crossover hits, Albert carved his own path, fusing soul horn sections with raw guitar to create anthems like Crosscut Saw and I'll play the blues for you. He fronted integrated bands in the segregated South, facing hostility with quiet defiance. Beck, who often defied rock norms himself, recognized a kindred rebel. Albert's influence on Beck's own recordings is unmistakable. Listen to the thick bends and elastic phrasing on Beck's Going Down, and you'll hear the King DNA. Even Beck's decision to embrace heavier gauge strings, something British contemporaries avoided, traces back to watching Albert wrestle mammoth tones from his upside-down setup. "He made me realize the guitar isn't delicate," Beck once said. "It's a beast you have to tame." Perhaps the most gripping intersection of their worlds came during a 1983 festival in Europe. Organizers arranged a late-night jam featuring both players. Witnesses recall a friendly duel that escalated into something almost supernatural. Beck launched complex jazz fusion runs. Albert countered with gut-punch bends that seemed to tear open the night air. The crowd screamed as the two men exchanged looks, half challenge, half admiration, each pushing the other higher. "I was sweating bullets," Beck confessed afterward. "He could kill you with one note. I had to fight for every phrase." Even decades later, Beck spoke of Albert King with a mix of awe and fear. "He's the storm you never see coming," Beck said in one interview. "When he plays, the sky changes color." That comment wasn't hyperbole to him. It was a memory of feeling the room darken when Albert hit a note that vibrated in the bones. Albert King passed away in 1992, but his shadow loomed large over Beck's later work. The slow, deliberate bends on "Cause We've Ended as Lovers," the tension-building silences in live improvisations. Those were tributes to the left-handed storm, who proved that a guitar could command the elements. Beck often closed interviews about influence with a quiet confession. "You can chase speed, you can chase volume, but you'll never catch Albert's soul. That's lightning in a bottle." For Jeff Beck, Albert King was more than a hero. He was a reminder that music's true power isn't about complexity or even perfection. It's about the ability to move the air, to make hearts pound and skies crack. And that, Beck believed, was the purest blues lesson of all. Freddie King, the Texas firestorm. If B.B. King was the velvet blade and Albert King the left-handed storm, Freddie King was the wildfire you never outrun. Jeff Beck said that seeing Freddie live was like standing too close to a freight train with no brakes. The first note could flatten a room, and the next 10 might set it ablaze. Freddie's legend began in the tough neighborhoods of Dallas, Texas, where he fused the raw emotion of Southern blues with the ferocity of Chicago's electric scene. By his teens, he was sneaking into clubs to watch Lightnin' Hopkins and T-Bone Walker, absorbing the swagger of Texas guitar and the grit of the Midwest. But what set Freddie apart wasn't just geography, it was the way he attacked the instrument. He played with bare fingers and a metal thumb pick, snapping and slapping strings until they screamed. Beck once called it a punch in the chest disguised as music. The first time Beck dropped a Freddie King record onto a turntable, he nearly jumped out of his seat. Tracks like Hide Away and The Stumble didn't just feature hot licks, they detonated with a rhythmic drive that felt closer to rock and roll than traditional blues. It was like someone took the blues and wired it to a car battery, Beck recalled. He practiced those instrumentals obsessively, trying to capture Freddie's percussive snap. But the secret was in Freddie's iron fingertips. "You can't fake that kind of attack," Beck admitted. "It's in the flesh." Their face-to-face meeting was pure folklore. In the early 1970s, Beck was touring the US when he got word Freddie was playing a late set at a Chicago club. He ducked out of his own after-party and slipped into the smoky room, just as Freddie launched into "Have You Ever Loved a Woman?" Witnesses swear the air itself seemed to vibrate. Beck stood near the bar, transfixed, as Freddie bent strings to the breaking point, his massive hands moving with shocking speed and precision. When the final note hung like a thunderclap, Beck realized he'd been holding his breath. Backstage, Freddie greeted him with a bear hug that nearly cracked ribs. "You the British cat everyone talks about?" he boomed. Beck nodded, humbled. Freddie grinned and handed him a battered Les Paul. "Show me what you got." Beck played a fiery run of blues rock lines, but before he could finish, Freddie snatched the guitar and fired back a riff so fierce the room erupted in cheers. Beck laughed in disbelief. "That's not fair," he said. Freddie winked. "That's Texas, son." What struck Beck most was Freddie's fusion of genres. Long before the term blues rock became fashionable, Freddie blurred lines between pure blues, R&B, and the emerging language of rock. Songs like Palace of the King and Going Down, later covered by Beck himself, carried the swagger of early rock anthems, but stayed anchored in blues authenticity. Beck admired that fearlessness. "He showed me the blues could be as loud and wild as anything," he said. "You didn't have to choose between soul and power. You could have both." Freddie's stage presence was equally explosive. Standing well over 6 feet tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, he dominated a stage like a heavyweight boxer. Yet his charisma was irresistible. Audiences felt both thrilled and a little afraid. Beck recalled watching Freddie stroll to the mic, thumbpick flashing under the lights, and thought, "That's how you own a crowd." It wasn't arrogance, it was gravitational pull. Beck carried those lessons into his own performances. Listen to his live versions of Going Down or Blue Wind, and you'll hear Freddie's influence in the sharp, percussive picking and sudden dynamic shifts. Beck even adopted some of Freddie's onstage habits, stepping forward for a searing solo, then retreating to let the band breathe, creating a push-pull tension that kept audiences riveted. There's a story that captures their mutual respect perfectly. During a jam session in New York, Freddie playfully challenged Beck to a riff duel. They traded choruses, each trying to outdo the other. Beck unleashed rapid-fire runs and dramatic whammy bar dives. Freddie answered with a single monstrous bend that nearly snapped the string. The crowd went wild, but instead of continuing the contest, Beck dropped to one knee, laughing, and offered a mock bow. Freddie raised his thumbpick in salute. Two masters, one unspoken understanding. Sometimes one perfect note beats 100 clever ones. Tragically, Freddie's blazing career was cut short. Years of relentless touring and punishing schedules led to health problems, and he died in 1976 at just 42. Beck was devastated. In the interviews, he often spoke of the loss with quiet sorrow. "He had so much more fire left," Beck said. "No one played like Freddie. No one ever will." Yet Freddie's spirit lived on in Beck's music. The biting attack in Beck's late 70s recordings, the fearless genre crossing of albums like Blow by Blow and Wired, even his decision to perform instrumentals that electrified mainstream audiences, all bore Freddie's fingerprints. When fans asked Beck to name the guitarist who could make him sweat, he rarely hesitated. Freddie King. "He scared me every time." Outro Jeff Beck often said the guitar is an endless frontier. But even explorers need guiding stars. For Beck, those stars wore crowns. B.B. King taught him the lethal power of a single note. Albert King showed him that space and silence can hit harder than speed. Freddie King proved the blues could roar with the energy of rock and still keep its soul intact. Together, these three giants formed a trinity that shaped Beck's identity more than any trend or chart success. They gave him courage to chase tone instead of fame, to play with emotion instead of ego, and to treat the guitar not as a prop, but as a living, breathing voice. Beck never stopped paying homage, whether in interviews, tribute concerts, or the subtle bends that made his solos sing. The fingerprints of the three kings remained. "Everything I ever tried to do," he once said, "started with them." So when you hear Jeff Beck bend a note until it breaks your heart, remember the kings behind the crown. B.B., Albert, and Freddie, three forces of nature who turned 6 strings into storms, velvet blades, and roaring fire.